Welcome to All Things Work, a content series from SHRM. I'm your host, Anne Sparaco. This week, we are diving in to the do's and don'ts of the hiring process to stay within those legal lines and to remain fair and unbiased. And here to talk about that is our expert, Michael Cohen, partner at global law firm Duane Morris. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Anne, so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
I really appreciate you being here. And we talked about how you have been in the practicing employment law for quite some time. So tell us a little bit about your experience. What really got you into it?
Sure. So what really got me into it actually goes back to about the time I was born, which is my mom. And that is when my mom was pregnant with me. She worked as a teacher in Chesterfield County, Virginia. And because of the school's mandatory maternity leave policy, was asked to leave teaching. My mom, who is not really somebody who creates problems or is a fighter, thought it wasn't fair, just wanted to see her seniors through their senior year, and took it to the school board and lost, and ultimately took it to court, and ultimately fought the case all the way to the United States Supreme Court and won. So with that kind of background in my life, this was all kind of pointed in one direction.
Wow. So you were literally just kind of, you were already in this situation.
A little bit.
Technically. Wow. And I assume she just kind of told you the story as you were growing up.
Yeah, we heard all about it.
And you provide your expert advice and your insights for companies across the country, right?
I do. I'm based in Philadelphia, the great city of Philadelphia. But my practice is national. Yeah, all over the country. And whether it's day-to-day counseling and helping organizations through sticky issues, or what I do a huge amount of, which is organizational training.
Okay. And can you dive a little bit into that organizational training, what that looks like a little bit?
Yeah, it looks like a lot of different things, candidly. There's day-to-day management training, things like harassment prevention and hiring and interviewing and performance management. And then there's a little bit more nuanced kind of programming that I do a lot of these days, programs that focus on mental health awareness, that focus on the mitigation of bias. And those are the topics that I really have enjoyed. And
so when we circle back to the hiring process, can you share how the civil rights laws have helped shape the foundation of legal and ethical hiring processes?
Sure. So we deal with laws like Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which lists as protected classes things like sex, race, color, religion, and national origin, which has been expanded to include LGBTQ plus status, sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression, things like the Age Discrimination and Employment Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And these laws all are crucial as part of ensuring any organization's hiring process doesn't run afoul of anti-discrimination statutes. There's also, obviously, as you mentioned, Anne, a fairness component to all of this. And there is nuance involved in this hiring process to ensure that while we're not running afoul of any federal or state or even local law, that we do want to make sure we're giving people a fair chance, that we recognize one size very rarely fits all. And that the more open-minded, I believe, we can be in considering qualifications, in considering what is actually relevant for purposes of a hiring decision, the better off from an organizational standpoint we all will be.
So what are some of the critical elements HR professionals really must keep in mind in order to stay compliant and avoid outright discrimination, especially in the hiring process?
So there are steps HR professionals can take. And certainly those steps need to be impressed upon the leaders who are their constituents, management. One thing we need to make sure we're doing in advance of any kind of hiring process, create what we like to call a uniform list of job-related questions, right? So that every individual who sits down before somebody who's conducting an interview is asked generally the same set of questions. Now, are they always asked in the same order? No. Are they always asked by the same person? Not necessarily. Are they the only questions that are being asked? My goodness, I hope not. Because if somebody's just going predetermined question, answer, predetermined question, they're doing a horrible job of listening. Because certainly an effective interview, you ask intelligent questions based on the answers that are provided. So if you're not doing that as part of an interview process, you're not doing a terribly effective job of interviewing. So this uniform list to serve as a framework is incredibly important. making sure leaders appreciate what it is they are allowed to ask and what they're not allowed to ask as part of any interview process, which is to say, we need to make sure people are educated as to where common mistakes are made, where they could potentially run afoul of federal, state, or local anti-discrimination statutes.
And it can be easy to fall into our daily, routines and just work too quickly. And people can forget that, simple acts can actually cause bigger problems for the organization and, cause implications on that potential employee that could have gotten a job, but because the process wasn't done correctly, you just kind of it just takes away the whole effort of hiring, right?
For sure. And sometimes we do get lost in what can become a comfortability of an interview process, that our guard goes down a little bit. And I am not suggesting, anybody that's ever known me or heard me speak, I am not coming anywhere close to suggesting we lose our humanity about the process. But we do have to be careful, because if we do let our guard down a little bit, we can get stuck in I heard you mention earlier, fairness and bias. And one of the traps we fall into very often is this reliance on something called affinity bias, which is the tendency to connect with people with whom you share interests or experiences or commonalities. And all of a sudden, during the course of an interview, we find out we're both from Philadelphia. And we start talking about the Eagles go Birds. And we start doing all of those things that Philadelphians do, and which ultimately has nothing to do with anybody's ability to perform the job. But we've made a hiring decision now based on this affinity bias. And that kind of thinking, that kind of process really can infect hiring decisions.
Yeah, and you don't really think about it. We talked about this in another episode before, addressing your own personal bias sometimes, because you may not even realize it's there. But it's good to take that approach where you kind of look inward a little bit and you ask yourself, okay, why am I making this decision for this person, or how am I viewing this person? And how can I view them in an unbiased way? Will that make, how is it different from how I'm viewing them now if I view them in a strictly unbiased, objective way? And if it seems different, then maybe you are looking at it in a biased perspective, right?
For sure. I mean, mitigating, well, first of all, is recognizing that we all have bias.
Yes.
Each and every one.
We're humans.
We're humans. We all have a different contextual lens through which we view the world. We've all had different experiences. Some of us have had better or different opportunities than others. So we all have bias. And the way I always say it is, having implicit bias is not something about which to be embarrassed or ashamed, but it's something that has to be recognized. And hopefully people who are really effective move beyond simply awareness and have identified tactics or strategies they can take to, as you said, mitigate against these biases.
Right. And you talked about strategies, so that actually leads into my next question about essentially beyond just complying to legal standards, because, we can learn the steps that take to do that, but it takes a little bit more to implement strategies to promote inclusion and diversity in the workplace. So what are some strategies employers should really consider to promote I&D?
So one of the things I always suggest, and I hammer organizations about, is creating this culture of listening. That the more you're able to simultaneously shut your mouth and open your ears, which is a dying art, by the way, the more we're able to learn what resonates with individuals. This idea of treating everybody the same all the time, 100% consistency, is kind of an anachronistic notion, and I think really ignores the differences and ignores and allows for a more bias to come forward. So this culture of listening, crucially important. To talk to leaders about bias. I mean, education, sorry for the platitude, it's the silver bullet. The more we actually get in front of people and have the opportunity to talk with them about the fact that, A, they have biases. Here are some examples of different biases. Here are the sources, potential sources of these biases. And here are steps we can take to mitigate against them. I talked to you earlier about affinity bias. One of the best ways I've ever learned to deal with or fight against or minimize affinity bias is to stop relying on the articulation of cultural fit, right? That's something great cultural fit or bad cultural fit. Don't look for cultural fit. Cultural fit, if it's a thing that exists, it's something we have plenty of. Start looking for cultural add. Start looking for those attributes. Start looking for those contacts. Start looking for those experiences that may not necessarily be round peg, round hole, but could add such value from an organizational standpoint. Can I give you one more?
Oh, yeah.
And this is the one that makes my head explode. Stop requiring 4-year college degrees for jobs that don't need 4-year college degrees.
Skills first hiring. Mm-hmm.
Right. So if we are looking to embrace notions of diversity, if we're looking to enhance inclusivity, why are we eliminating a massive segment of the population that might otherwise be incredibly capable of performing our jobs because they were able to afford a college education?
That's a changing landscape that we're finding. We have a few experts who speak on that topic. I always find it fascinating.
Yeah.
And going back to that active listening.
Yes.
I remember our CHRO Jim Link here at SHRM. I always love listening to his interviews with reporters. He was talking about our civility campaign, and he said something around the words of, "We lost the art of listening," and that is just being able to open up to other people's thoughts, active listening to understand.
And what you hear is competitive listening.
Mm-hmm.
You start forming your response before the other person's done talking. So you've disengaged at that point. And the more leaders can shut up and open their ears, find your inner Mr. Rogers, find your inner Ted Lasso, find that willingness to just take in information. And you're not going to forget what you were going to share. You'll remember. It'll still be there.
Yeah.
But this idea of active listening is massively important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, not everybody can be a goldfish, but we can try.
We can try. We certainly
we
can
love
try.
Ted Lasso. It was a lot of great lessons in patience and civility and just empathy.
Mental health awareness. I've created a program based on the show, and it is my favorite talk
awesome.
to give. Yeah,
it was such an inspiration. I
really
think it changed a lot of people's lives too. Obviously, there's some challenges when it comes to like preventing discrimination and implicit bias. Nothing comes without somewhat of a challenge. So what are some of the most significant challenges you've seen employers face, I guess, throughout your career?
So one of the biggest ones is what I like to refer to as the back in my day form of leadership. And that is, I am who I am. I'm not going to change. Fundamentally, I am unwilling to adapt with the times. This is the same person that will tell you they have no implicit bias, which is simply not possible, because they have not had the exact same experiences as anybody else. So one of the largest challenges is fighting against this notion to continue to do things the way they've always been done, simply because that's the way they've always been done. Let's come back to Ted. The second scene from the first episode of the first year, he and Coach Beard are on the plane flying to London. And he says, "Are we nuts for doing this, for taking on coaching a European football team?" And they coached American college football. And Coach Beard looks at him and says, "Yeah, this is nuts." And Ted says, "Well, taking on a challenge is a lot like riding a horse. If you're comfortable while you're doing it, you're probably doing it wrong." And that's a message I impart to leaders all the time. I coach girls softball. It is a message I impart to my girls. You better be comfortable being uncomfortable. And in the world of human resources, being stagnant doesn't work. Not being open to new ideas will render you a relic. And that is not to say we ignore the past. We have to learn from things that have been done before. But behind every failed enterprise is the notion of, well, we're just going to keep doing things the way we've done things because that's the way they've been done. Take on that challenge. Learn a new way to do something.
When it comes to effectively addressing those challenges in the recruitment process, you talked about kind of addressing that bias and addressing kind of like the old way fashion. What other ways can we address these types of challenges? Do you have any advice for that?
So this college degree idea, take it to a little bit of a greater degree. Stop thinking so linearly with regard to the hiring process, that a person must have done A, B, and C in order effectively to be able to perform the job that we are seeking to fill. Well, I don't know that that's necessarily the case. I went to the University of Pennsylvania undergrad. And when I was in college back in the early 90s, when investment banks would come on campus, they would interview pretty routinely and pretty strictly just students from Wharton, the undergraduate business school, And overwhelmingly, those students who had finance backgrounds or accounting backgrounds. Now, and the thinking was, those are the only people who are qualified to do these finance jobs. Now, while they still interview finance and accounting, they're interviewing econ, they're interviewing English, they're interviewing philosophy, because what we've started to realize is, for most jobs, we can teach the skills. Are you somebody who knows how to write? Are you somebody, because I can't teach you how to write when you're 26. Are you somebody who can get up in front of a group and not offend 3/4 of the group in the first 12 seconds? Because I don't have time to teach you that. I can teach you the job skills. Do you have the non-traditional attributes that we might be looking at? So it's not just the college degree. It's stop thinking in such a linear fashion with regard to requirements.
I think we all can experience being like that intern where, you're just like, okay, I just got to finish my 4-year degree and I'll be good. But then you go through the actual process out of college and you're thinking, oh, they want more than that. And you have to show who you are as a person, because that will really speak to how you manage projects, how you manage people, how you work with other people. So I think that's really great. In addition to the skills first hiring discussion, because it really is essential to add, like you said, add to that company culture.
What can you bring to enhance the experience for everybody else that's around you? And that comes in a lot of different forms, depending on where you are inside of the organizational structure, what the nature of the company or the organization happens to be. But all of us can lend value. All of us can bring a new way of thinking to the workplace. But if we continue to hire the same way we've always hired, and everybody has to have a college degree and everybody has to have a certain background, there are some organizations that'll even go as far, we only hire from elite schools. Like, first of all, I don't know what that means. I want to see a list. The other part of it is, not everybody can afford to go to those schools. And from a mathematics standpoint, I will tell you, I got into the law because it was my understanding there would be no math. But it seems pretty clear to me, if I can go to University X with a full academic scholarship and end up $0 in debt versus going to University Y, which is one of these quote unquote elite schools, and end up coming out of school $500,000 in debt, I'm not sure that's a particularly difficult question to answer for the overwhelming majority of the population. And yet we focus on University Y. We focus on the elite schools, which is, I just think it's so myopic in its thinking. I think it's so short-sighted. There are so many unbelievably qualified candidates for so many jobs that have non-traditional backgrounds. And the organizations that are embracing these non-traditional backgrounds are just doing so much better in terms of recruiting and retention.
I think we were all raised on Elle Woods going to Harvard a little too much.
Absolutely.
Just kidding. She was awesome in that movie, and I love her character development. But not everybody who came out of that Harvard class actually succeeded like she did. So it really depends on who you are as a person. I want to switch gears here a little bit and dive into AI. So we have a lot of automation when it comes to the recruitment process. We have some HR professionals out there who say they actually use it for screening candidates or even creating that job description. So my question here, are there any concerns you've seen around this evolving landscape of AI and technology when it comes to playing a role in discrimination against certain candidates during the hiring process? Because, and we've talked about this before on All Things Work, is, what you feed your AI tool is what it will kind of feed back to you. So if you're not feeding it saying, hey, we want to be unbiased, we want to be fair, it might be biased in some way. I'm not exactly sure the details into it, but I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah. And the way you described it, I think, is incredibly apt, which is what you feed in is what you're going to get out. Mm-hmm. So to the extent we go about using AI because we think it's going to be more efficient, because we think we're going to be able to get through the process more quickly and with more agility and finding the target person. But if our input in is something that fairly logically is going to result in information that we ought not have coming out, then we have a flawed process. Right. So, which is to say, if we're first of all, there are states and there are jurisdictions that are starting to create legislation around the use of AI in the employment processes. Mm-hmm. So we need to make sure we're not running afoul of the law. But even putting that aside, we want to make sure that data in is going to result in the data out that we want,
Right.
which means it can't be done haphazardly. It needs to be done with a great deal of a forethought, using people who are expert in not just in employment law, but who are expert in the field specifically of dealing with artificial intelligence in, as we're talking about here, the hiring process. It has to be done incredibly carefully.
It does. It does. And like we say, you just kind of got that human oversight on that. That's really necessary. You can't just fully rely on artificial intelligence.
No. Yeah, and overwhelmingly organizations are using it for their initial screening processes. And perhaps that's certainly easier. And when you're dealing with a company that has 150 employees, the utilization of AI in the screening process is probably not necessary. You're dealing with an employer that has 150,000 employees and is dealing with 10,000 open requisitions on a monthly basis. There's going to have to be, in all likelihood, the use of, whether it's AI or some electronic form of culling through applications and resumes to determine, here are the 50 that we're going to start with. And that's when the human element comes in.
Right. And our Chief Data and Insights Officer, Alex Lonzo, he talks about how we're still in that infancy stage of AI. So, but it's going to evolve quickly and soon enough, like he said, like maybe over 10 years from now, that AI will be like our teammate. So we got to treat it like we're watching over our teammate a little bit. We're making sure they're doing their job as well and doing it well.
I think that's right. And I think teammate is such a great analogy, because implicit in the idea of a teammate is AI is not doing it alone. That the human component of all of this is not completely ignored. We're not allowing for the AI or the data-driven analytics or electronics to create to make the decision on its own. The human aspect of it isn't going to go away entirely.
When it comes to employment law, it like we said, it's complex. It has a lot to it, different aspects, different standards that people have to keep up with. So what are some, how can HR teams actually stay informed and responsive to the latest updates in legislation or best practices in order to stay relevant and avoid that bias hiring?
Sure. So, I mean, this is going to sound sort of, I don't know what it's going to sound like. SHRM does an incredibly good job at helping.
Thank you.
But it's real. It's, HR professionals have this resource available to them, and it's a massive resource available to them in terms of the consumption of content. And there are so many different ways. There's the traditional sort of reading of magazines and things like that, but podcasts or content consumption of this nature is incredibly helpful. You can't get complacent. You have to constantly be evolving and constantly be learning. The workplace in 2024 is incredibly different than it was in 2020, which is incredibly different than it was in 2015. Look, none of us thought about hybrid work in 2018. Not none of us. Very
really.
Few organizations thought about hybrid work. What are we doing now in terms of relaxed dress in the workplace? Things that really do in a meaningful way potentially enhance workplace culture were ideas that just weren't embraced in a real way by a lot of organizations prior to the pandemic. We're coming back and we've evolved. I mean, using the pandemic as an example, there were so many things that we had to learn about in a very,
it's an example we use for a lot of things, which is, it's something everybody can really remember because it just happened.
Sure. And we were all forced to learn from an HR standpoint laws that had existed for years that we never paid any attention to, reimbursement laws for people who are working from home. So this constant, not just willingness, but desire to stay up to date with changes in the laws and the jurisdictions in which your organization operates, I think it's baseline. I don't think that's next level. I mean, I think that from an HR professional standpoint, that's the stuff that has to be going on every day. And where they consume that content, where they get that information, the sources are so plentiful right now. My goodness, you can go on TikTok. And I do. And living in the world of speaking about mental health and speaking about bias, there's so much incredibly helpful content on places like TikTok. I mean, wherever it is that you learn best, go there, but also vary your sources. So that, to your point, the bias does not result from constantly consuming information from the same kind of source.
I always say, like, I had this phrase in my head a while ago. It was, if you read all the same type of books, you're going to have the same type of thoughts, or the same from the same author. You got to read various books, different books, something from different perspectives, different genres, and then you can think in different ways, and learn new things.
And take that back to what we were talking about earlier in the hiring process.
Mm-hmm.
The more diversity in the decision-making process, the more likely it is that you'll end up with diversity in the hiring process,
Mm-hmm.
right? So again, similar data in, similar data out.
Mm-hmm. And going back to inclusion and diversity, we'll leave on this note. Do you have any examples that you've seen throughout your career of maybe some innovative strategies companies have taken to really enhance and actually successfully enhance inclusion and diversity?
Absolutely. Work tracking systems, so
Okay.
that people aren't constantly doing the exact same work for the exact same people,
Oh,
right? So that
okay.
we give other people the opportunities that they might not otherwise have. Something that drives me a little bananas is mitigating against this idea of a competition of pain. And what I mean by that is my marginalization is more important than your marginalization. Making available in the workplace the fact that we all need to be treated fairly, based on the experiences we've had. And I can share a very quick one with you. I'm Jewish, and a couple of years ago, there was a hostage situation in a synagogue in Cooley, Texas. And the rabbi was held hostage. Several of the congregants were held hostage. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not deeply religious, but this shook me. And I remember going into work the following day and sharing my experience of being shook with a colleague. And the response I got was not one of empathy. It was not one of kindness. It was not one of understanding. It was, now you know what it feels like to be a fill-in other historically marginalized group. And I remember thinking, okay, I get it, but why the competition for pain? Why does there have to be this hierarchy of marginalization? So we talk about work tracking systems. We talk about eliminating the competition for pain. Speaking specifically with regard to race, color blindness is never an answer, right? I don't see color. Absolutely absurd statements, right? If you're sighted, you see color. If you're sighted, you see gender expression. This elimination or mitigation against microaggressions of that nature. These are just some of a few. A few of many, I should say.
A few of many, yes, absolutely. That's a great strategy to talk about and to learn about it. So thank you so much for taking the time, Michael, for this episode of All Things Work. Really enjoyed your insight. I loved your example, especially your story about what your mom went through, what really inspired you to start your career here, and how it's really come full circle and you're still working hard for this effort. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
And that'll do it for this week's episode of All Things Work. You can go to shrm.org/allthingswork to check out our newsletter, our podcast, and so much more. You can also follow us on social media, comment, like, we want you to be part of this conversation. That'll be it for this week. We'll see you next time.